for non-academics watching, like for people that, they're artistic creatives, that want to
Yep.
push the gospel message, but sometimes have been taught like a different model of scripture reading where it's more eisegesis, where it's like, well, what does this mean for me, And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the process of exegeting scripture and how that can help Christians like apply that to finding purpose in their art, and in the way they live on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a great question. The point, of course, is reading scripture is reading it as a single storyline that develops from beginning to end instead of reading isolated verses. The point that we're trying to do in Bible Project is to look at as the piece of the Bible and try to following through what does the whole story do. So we locate particular passages within the storyline of the whole. And so when we look at a verse, like the Romans 12, where it's talking about overcoming evil with good there at the 12:21, if we put that in the storyline that we're overcoming evil and how we do that, we're following the model of Jesus, who instead of coming in and killing, he actually takes the sin into himself and suffers death. So that picture of the upside down kingdom, instead of coming with soldiers and swords and nuclear weapons, he actually comes with a way of weakness and serving and loving. But that's how we do that, is try to put those passages in the context of the whole storyline of Scripture.
Yeah. And what would you recommend for people that maybe haven't been to school, for biblical scholarship? That they still want to have the Christian message, and because the goal of an artist in the kingdom is to point back to Jesus and to point to the gospel. So,
Absolutely.
what are some simple, I guess, action steps, but also just ways that maybe we need to reshape our thinking about it, so that when we approach
Yep.
the text with, I don't want to say amateur eyes, but less seasoned reading.
Yeah.
Like if you just got out of college or high school and you want to write a song about the gospel, and but you haven't studied under professors, you haven't read a lot of
Yep.
theologians. If you want to kind of speak to that, like because those kingdom workers also, their ultimate goal should be, if it isn't already, should be to point back to the
Absolutely.
gospel and point to the story of Jesus,
Absolutely.
like you're talking about.
Yep. And see, that's the burden of what we've done in Bible Project, is to come back. And if you go to Bible, just Google Bible Project and it'll pop up. It's bibleproject.com, or thebibleproject.com. And if you start looking at the videos there, if you go to Explore tab there on the front page, the first thing will open up is a series of theme videos. And the very first video we've got on there is how to read the Bible, because that's the goal. Instead of getting into specifics, we begin with the project video. How do you read the Bible? And so they're in video format, and there's also text available, but I'm thinking of people who are more visual, who more are into videos than into just text on page. We're showing you how to read the Bible. The podcast will unpack it with words, and it is unpacking this idea of how to read and see these themes as starting to develop. And then we've got a whole bunch of examples. The Heaven and Earth video is the very first one. The favorite of both Tim Mackey and me is the Gospel of the Kingdom, that begins with the gospel back in Acts chapter, or in Isaiah chapter 52, and traces that forward using the theme of beautiful feet, from the beautiful feet of the one messenger who's carrying the good news that our God reigns in the midst of the destruction of Babylon,
Mm.
to the truth of Jesus Christ. His feet are nailed to the cross, and in his beautiful feet, we have the message that our God reigns, even though he's just been killed. So that's what I do. Instead of trying to maybe sign up for Bible classes here at Western or some other good school, would be to start with the Bible Project videos. That's what we put on there. They're totally free. Of course, we'll accept your contributions.
Yeah.
It's crowdfunded.
Yeah.
But actually, we're doing very well financially, because it's such a good product that people realize this is good. And so they're throwing a good bit of money in through the crowdfunding.
Hmm.
So we just encourage you to use these materials, but start with that how to read the Bible videos. They're great.
Yeah, and there's a huge value in this approach to scripture, because this is how we find what God's actually communicating to us. We can
Yep,
miss the point completely.
yep,
If you
yep,
would, I mean, we're very positive toward exegesis right now, but another reason,
yep.
I think another way to point to it, I was wondering if you could talk about the dangers. Specifically, of when we come to the text from an eisegesis standpoint, where like, what are the dangers of coming to it and not trying to find out what it's saying, but trying to decide for ourselves what we want it to say? If you want to talk about, like, maybe what are some of the wrong approaches and why this approach is so important when it comes to scripture and how that applies to our art.
Well, if I can be personal about this, back when I was trying to get some of the stuff figured out myself, this is back in the 60s. I'm really old. I I was reading in the book of Revelation, which is not the best place to start your studies, but I went there
Yeah.
because it's pretty dramatic. And I'm reading about these locusts. They're in the book of Revelation, and the plagues. They're in the book of Revelation. And I start letting my imagination run. And well, those locusts sounded a lot like Sikorsky helicopters. At that point, I was in the Philippines, and Vietnam was just up the street, and that's where all the war was going on. And the helicopters are flying around, and they were shooting missiles and rescuing people. And I said, well, gosh, those locusts, that's just God's way of talking about helicopters coming. Well, that's just absolute nonsense. But it sure made sense at the time because I didn't have a biblical theology. I wasn't using my cross references that are in any good Bible. And of course, that points us back to the locusts of Joel, who uses a plague of locusts as a symbol of God's judgment on sinful people. So it was several years before I was smart enough to look at my cross references and start interpreting the locusts of Revelation in a biblical theological way instead of what made sense to me as a reader, sitting in a house in Manila, Philippines.
Hmm. Wow, yeah, that
Another
makes
good
sense. Yeah.
suggestion,
Hmm.
another good suggestion is don't read the Bible by yourself. Read the Bible and don't just read it with your buds. Try to get a group together of different ethnicities, different cultures, different theological tribes, and open the Bible and read it together and say, what does the Bible actually say? And the amazing thing is, when I read it with different cultures, different ethnicities, different theological tribes, and I discover we all agree, yep, that's what it says, we will almost certainly be on the right track.
Yeah.
And with and a lot of times stuff we've been taught will come up to be shown to be wrong. For example, in John chapter 4, the woman at the well, I had always read that woman as a terrible sinner. I mean, she's been married 5 times and living with some guy now. And I said, gosh, what a terrible sinner that God brings the gospel of salvation to. And then I was talking with a friend from Central America, and he said, Gary, think. I said, okay, help me. He said, okay, who has power to divorce in the Bible? I said, well, I'm not sure. He said, go read Deuteronomy 24. So I did. And it's the man who kicks his wife out. And he said, Gary, who has the power to divorce in a Jewish culture? I said, well, I guess the man does, the husband does. Yep, he said. Okay, this woman is divorced 5 times. What does that mean? I said, well, if what you're saying is true, she's been kicked out 5 times. And I realized as he talked to me, I'd been reading this woman as a terrible sinner when she's probably not a terrible sinner, but a survivor of severe abuse.
Hmm.
It gives a very different picture on the thrust of that passage, is here's somebody who's been subjected to severe abuse who is looking for help. When Jesus shows up, she goes on a journey of discovery and discerns who he is. It's a very different story of Jesus helping an abuse survivor. And that just was because I was reading it from a guy from Central America who helped me see things that I'd never seen before.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess that'd be
Yeah.
a practical step for, I mean, if you want to get the right idea, don't read it by yourself. I like that a lot. And that also points back to our whole focus of community and gathering together around
Right.
a table. And digging
Yes,
into
very much.
Scripture and the message of Jesus.